Genesis chapter 11, unless you can prove that they were running away from the city at about 15 miles something. So Genesis chapter 11, everybody's pretty familiar with the story of the Tower of Babel. There may be some interesting things we've never thought about, we've never talked about in that, or in the genealogy that follows. And we may look back a little bit to chapter 10, because these interrelate some. Which I'm excited Tyler's here. Tyler is a chapter 10 aficionado, so I'm going to look at Tyler occasionally and be like, hey, do you want to add something? But anyway. Yeah, I tried to get him to teach chapter 10, but he was sick.
I ended up getting sick anyway. So.
Yeah, I tried. Anyway, Chapter 11, let's start in verse 1. I think we've started over here the last week. Let's start on this side. So, Bob, do you want to start us off on verse 1? He's like, I guess so.
And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech.
I know I gave you a hard verse.
It was
Right.
All right, next. Yes, sir.
As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there.
Wow. Yeah, okay, that's all right. I was just like, man, where'd I go? But that's all right. Shinar being the same place where the city of Babel is, and we learned last week that Babel was built by Nimrod. Genesis 10, 8 through 10. Go ahead and read that.
And Cush begat Nimrod, and began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar.
Okay, so obviously this would have been began by Nimrod. He would have started other cities near there. He's the first person the term kingdom is used with in the Bible, and so he, at least in theory, had been part of gathering people together to create this place, these specific cities. All right, verse 3.
And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar.
I'm always really curious what slime they had for mortar.
Oil.
Oil?
Yeah, petroleum. This is right in the middle of the Iraqi oil fields.
Right.
And that's the best theory, is that it was petroleum.
Wow.
How does petroleum come up? Does it come up thicker then? It'd have to if it's going to be.
How would it come to the
I've not, no.
You ever heard of them?
Yeah, but
The La Brea tar pits?
I've heard of.
Yeah, well, the stuff comes out so hard that it can actually be cut into blocks.
huh?
Some of it comes up kind of
It's more like
gooey.
tar.
Yeah.
And others of it, it's in actually blocks that can cut it out in big bricks. No, it surely doesn't.
Yeah.
It surely doesn't.
That's really interesting. Anyway, so they had the slime for mortar. Tyler?
And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth.
Interesting. So they wanted to make a name for themselves. They wanted to build up so they couldn't be dispersed, which is the opposite of what God told them to do. They said you need to spread out and subdue the world, and so that was not necessarily what they ought to have done. Now the Tower of Babel would have been built somewhere around 101 to 280 years after the flood. That would be assuming that Peleg refers to the nations being separated in his time due to the Tower of Babel. So Peleg would have been born around 101 years later, and he would have died 280 years after the flood. So that's kind of how that time frame moves in. So, you don't know that it happened right when he was born. You don't know if it happened right when. But if it was, his name was based upon the world being changed, you'd guess it happened pretty similar to that time frame. The years can be added up. We'll look at that maybe below. There's some other year things we're going to look up. There's a lot of math in the early stages of the Bible, so fun stuff. Verse 5.
And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men built.
Okay,
And
If-
the Lord, oh,
go ahead. You can go ahead.
Okay, and the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they have one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do.
Okay, verse 7. Let's do that one too.
That one? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Go to, let us go down, and we are confounded in language, that they may not understand one another's speech.
Okay, so what does it mean that God came down? I mean, God's omnipresent. Why did he have to come look at it?
Say the question again, sorry.
In verse 5, it says, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower. God's omnipresent and omniscient. Why did he need to come down and come look at it?
Probably more for us, the way we see things. We
Okay.
would have to go to a different city to see it.
Right.
Fair judgment.
Okay.
It's a point that anything we build up got us to come down to see. We can never build as high as him.
Those are all nifty ideas. Yeah, so as I looked up this passage, one of the things that kept coming up in the different commentators is this would be a way that God could show that he was giving a fair judgment of what was going on. I actually had never heard your viewpoint on that. That's pretty cool. So,
The idea that man had to build up what God had to come down to see. So man can never build up to God. God always has to come down.
pretty nifty. But their intention was they wanted to build a tower to heaven. It's interesting if there was a picture of man trying to go his own way and reach God on his own, this is probably it. Cain is used as that picture throughout other times in the Bible. The Tower of Babel, you see this. But ultimately, they didn't want to fall under the obedience of God. They didn't want to do what God had told them to do. And so, what about verse 6? It says, the Lord said, behold, the people is one, they have one language. This shall they begin to do, and nothing will be restrained from them. What in the world does that mean?
The key word I'm looking at is imagine, because, I know that old movie, if you build it, they will come. Yeah. I mean, it's, everything that we know, even in technology, always begins with the imagination, so I think the imagination can be something dangerous, because it does oppose God in many ways. I mean, it's good and it's not good.
Well, that's a good answer. Did I hear someone else start? Go ahead.
Yeah, when people get together, we tend to magnify each other's sins.
Yeah.
We get ideas for how to sin and what the mechanics of our particular sin are from ourselves, and we pass them on to other people.
Yeah.
When we get together in big groups, the bigger the group, the more look at New York City as compared to Zebra.
Just saying.
Just saying, just saying. But you get people together in large groups, and we tend to complement each other. And if the scripture is true, that the imaginations of men's hearts are evil.
Continually, yeah.
That's why God doesn't like big cities.
Interesting. So, he noted that this would be done so that they would be restrained on some level. Their intention is to go against God. Their intention is to make a name for themselves, to build to themselves a tower to heaven. And so ultimately they would have been focused on and probably receiving glory and attention that should have ultimately gone to God had they built this tower to heaven. Now, I think they would have been really disappointed if they were able to build something high enough that they made it to space, because they wouldn't last very long. I think that would be a little bit rough on their end. Oh, you gotta lift your head up a little bit. All right. So, but yeah, so God says, let us go down. Really interesting. Notice the plural language again. Multiple times at this point, God has defined himself plurally. Now, this is not the same as people today calling themselves they, them. It's a little bit different. So God is not like human beings where we are one being and one person, but God is one being and three persons. So that is a very succinct definition of the Trinity. But that is the point. He is an us. That said, Matthew Henry had a really interesting note here. It says, "Observe the wisdom and mercy of God in the methods taken for defeating this undertaking, and the mercy in God in not making penalty equal to the offense, for if he deals with us according to our sins. The wisdom of God in fixing upon a sure way to stop these proceedings. If they could not understand one another, they could not help one another. This would take them off of their building. God has various means and effectual ones to baffle and defeat the projects of proud men that set themselves against him. And particularly he divides them among themselves. Notwithstanding their union and obstinacy, God was above them, for who have ever hardened his heart against him and prospered?" Beautiful thing. All right, verse 8.
So the Lord scattered them abroad upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city.
Okay, so they were no longer building this city. It didn't work out. They were spread across the face of the earth. Verse 9.
Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth. And from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth.
Okay, so from this point, everyone is scattered. People are set to their places with people of a similar language. Notice when you were in chapter 10, every time it gets done, it tells you that these were separated by their families, by their tongues, by their nations. So chapter 10, verse 5.
By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, every one after his tongue, after their families, in their nations.
Yeah, so these people split very specifically. They split with specific languages and places they were meant to be. Interestingly enough, this is talking about Japheth in the first section, Japheth's family, and it notes them that they would be the isles of the Gentiles. And we had talked last time about where Japheth ended up going. It's pretty cool what we think of in the New Testament when we think of the Gentiles. A lot of cases it's used synonymously with the Greeks, and Japheth's family had seemed to go out that direction as well. So I just went down one baby. I'm 8 pounds lighter.
Is he 8 pounds?
No. He's 6 something. Yeah, he is growing.
Oh, he's probably more than 6.
Well, he was 6 something. I don't know what he weighs now. It's been a little while. All right, let's keep going. Next verse. Genesis 10:20.
These are the sons of Ham, after their families, after their tongues, in their countries, and in their nations.
All right, so you have that same concept after their tongues, families, in their countries, in their nations. But notice it's not described the same way the first one is. It's not saying after the tribes of the Gentiles or things like that. It's described somewhat differently. And then the last one, Genesis 10:31 and 32.
I'm in their own chapter. Therefore, these are the sons of Shem after their families, after their tongue, in their lands, after their nations. These are the families of the sons of Noah, after their generations, in their nation, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood.
Okay, so this is how the nations were divided up in the earth after the flood.
Interesting thing about this, if the date range of 101 to 280
Yeah.
after the flood is correct, and I think it is,
Mm-hmm.
that means Noah was still alive when all this was going on.
Oh Oh, yeah.
And people, 100 years after the flood, are already so messed up
Yeah.
that God has to intervene again.
Didn't take them any
Yeah,
time at
and
all.
they didn't learn. I mean, that's the amazing thing.
Yeah.
They didn't learn. In a century, they already thought that they could, I mean, you'd think that there would be some memory of what had happened just a century before.
I mean, I've spent a lot of time looking at the Israelites, and they forget within a few days. So I don't.
3 days.
I mean, it depends on the scenario. From the time they get out of Egypt to like the first time they're like, God, why do you hate us? It's like a month, and I'm like, what is going on? You just watched them do miracle upon miracle upon miracle.
You gotta watch Californians, they lose it in about an hour.
We all do the same thing.
Yeah.
We do.
Yeah.
We are.
Yep, it is. Mankind is a fickle bunch. That said, let's go to verse 10.
These are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begat Faxared
Sounds good.
2 years after the flood.
Okay, so Shem was 100 years old when he begat Arphaxad, or Arphaxad, or however you want to pronounce his name. But that was 2 years after the flood. So, in total, Shem lived 500 more years, it says, after he did this. So he would have lived to 600. Very intense, very good thing for us to know. Verse 11.
And Shem lived after he begat whatever his name is, 500 years and begat sons and daughters.
So, although it only lists one as you go down this line, just like it has in previous genealogies, it just tells you what you need to know. It does note that he had other sons and daughters. There were lots of people being born. This is the one that they want you to know about. Alright, Shem actually would have been alive for most of his posterity up until, I think I math that out later, but it would have been extensive. Like, I think he technically would have lived into the time of Isaac. So we'll look at that in a minute, because I did some math last night. But yeah, he outlived even most of his children. Not all of them, but most of them. All right, so verse 12. Are we starting over? Go ahead.
And Ashbrag lived 5 and 30 years and begat Salah.
All right, 35 years. Keep that in mind.
He was
Yes,
a
sir.
baby. I mean, usually they're 100 years old when they start having kids.
Yeah, they start much quicker after after
Yeah.
this. They're like, I guess it's time.
And Arphaxad lived after he begot Salah 403 years and begot sons and daughters.
Yep. All right, so again, Arphaxad lived in total 438 years. You see that the amount that they're living is going down. Noah would have been the person who lived the longest at this point. Obviously not previous to the flood, but after the flood, he ended up living to 950 is what was determined. His son, the next one down, only seems to live to 600. And then the next one down, I mean, is already down into the 400s. It's going down pretty quickly. All right, I think we're on verse 14.
And Salah lived 30 years and begat Eber.
Okay. Read verse 15 as well.
And Salah lived after he begat Eber 403 years and begat sons and daughters.
All right, so again, you've got multiple people being born. You get one person named, but he ended up living a total of 433 years. All right, go read verse 16.
And Eber lived 44 and 30 years and begat Peleg.
Again, we're down to that. These are the people having children much earlier, 30, 35, 34, 30, that kind of thing. And this isn't even to say maybe this isn't even their first child. We don't know. It's just the one that is listed. And they would have had apparently lots of years of posterity. So Eber lived 466 years. This would be the one kid that would have potentially overlived Shem. Of Shem's children, none of the others would have lived longer than him. He would have passed them in life, other than Eber. All right, verse 18.
And Peleg lived 30 years and begot Ruth.
Okay. And verse 19.
And Peleg lived after and begat Ruth 209 years and begat sons and daughters.
Okay, and you're given the information in chapter 10 that Peleg was the one in whom the world was divided during his time. So you would have already had these different numbers. That's how we come up to the 101 years. 2 years after the flood, the first child is born, then it's 35 years, then it's 34 years, then it's 30 years, and finally here's Peleg. So regardless of whether or not that happened right when he was born or later, we don't know. And actually you're given a little bit of different posterity for Peleg in the previous chapter. It doesn't mention Ru, I don't think, but interestingly enough. All right, so, and Ru lived 32 years and begat Serug.
239.
Did I read that wrong?
Yeah.
No, 2 and 30 years. I read verse 20.
Oh.
Verse 21, who's next?
And Ru lived after he begot Saram 207 years and begat sons and daughters.
Okay, so in total that comes out to 239 years, so that's where we are there. And we're going to start finally getting into names that we may recognize. So after in the time that Ru lived 239 years, verse 22, go ahead and read that for us.
He lived 30 years and begat Nahor.
Yep, 23.
And Serug lived after he begat Nahor 200 years and begat sons and daughters.
Okay, and so Nahor is probably one of the first names that you're like, hey, I know that one. He's related to Abraham somehow. Serug lived 230 years, so again, you still see the ages going down. The only age that went up a little bit was Eber. And so let's go ahead and read verse 24.
And Nahor lived 9 and 20 years and begat Terah.
Yep. All right, and verse 25.
And Nahor lived after he begat Terah 119 years and begat sons and daughters.
All right, so this is a significant drop. We're down to 148 years is all he's got. Now, at this point, you have to understand, Noah lived 350 years after the flood. Noah would still be alive during Serug's time. Shem is still alive. And so you've got these people who have overlived and who are still very early attestations for what happened. Now, question is, do they all speak the same language? Does Noah still speak the same language as his sons? It's an interesting thought. So that may be where some of the people come to some confusion. Maybe they don't have that direct link anymore to the flood. But you may have some similar languages or similar base languages out of Shem. It's hard to tell. Probably not. But
Didn't we read just previously, though, that they were separated according to their tongues and according to their families and according to their nations?
we did. But it specifically said the families and nations, I feel like, are probably those individual families and nations that are listed, not necessarily, because even of the people that were listed under Shem's family, they became different nations with different tongues. And so they would have, on some level, maybe had a similar base language. Like for a lot of the Indo-European language, they think Sanskrit was a base language. So maybe you'd have something like that, but it definitely would change as the time's going on. So the opportunity to communicate is getting lesser and lesser.
The other possibility, though, is that since this is following the line of Shem, which will ultimately result in the Messiah,
Yeah.
that they did retain
Yeah.
either way.
Yeah.
It's against either way.
Yeah. Thoughts, Tyler? Nothing to add?
I'll note that it didn't seem to take long for these people to communicate with each other. Abraham was able to communicate with the Egyptians. So,
Yeah. So back to that, it could have been a few base languages that dialects formed out of, kind of thing.
yeah.
Okay. They must have been far better at language than we are, because I feel like for us to.
They had a lot more time. So.
They had the same amount of time. I'm just kidding. All right. Let's see. Where are we? Verse 26.
Yes. And Terah lived 70 years and begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran.
All right. Now, it doesn't go back and list them specifically on what year each of them were born. I don't know if that necessarily means they were triplets or if that's about the time he started having them. Interestingly enough, though. He had those kids when he was 70. It shouldn't have seemed too out of place for Abraham to think he could have kids later in life if his dad had some at 70. And not to mention, you've got plenty of people who would still be alive during the time of Abraham who had lived hundreds of years and had multiple kids. So it's interesting to think about how Abraham responded, later, I think in Genesis, 17 or 18 or 19, or I'm trying to remember where it is. When God comes to him, I think it's 17, and he says, hey, you're going to have this kid. And he's like, can a child be born to me who's 100 years old? You've seen people older than 100 have children, or you could have, so it shouldn't be that surprising. But it seems to surprise him.
Abraham might have been looking at Sarah more than himself.
That's true. And we're going to talk about that in a minute as well.
Well, they've been together all that time and hadn't had children.
Right.
So,
That's true.
She's 90 years old now.
yeah, so.
Well, the other thing is, you know how old these men were, but you also don't know how old their wives have been. And
It's interesting because the kings note that Sarah's beautiful
Yeah.
when she comes around, and she's like in her 70s, 80s when she's going to these places. So,
yeah, beautiful
Quite
enough
a
to
bit
want to
different.
be married by pharaohs and kings.
right.
So it's intense. All right, verse 27.
Yes.
Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran begat Lot.
Hey, I've heard of those people. Verse 28.
And Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity in Ur of the Chaldees.
So Abraham is from Ur of the Chaldees. Very interesting. They would have been people who were very early good at astronomy and mathematics and things like that. And the idea is he maybe could have brought some of those ideas elsewhere as he grew and had traveled to different places. Now, obviously, they probably weren't the only people who had those abilities. There were probably other nations that also had started to figure some of those things out. But he's from the Chaldees. Verse 29.
And Abram and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, and the daughter of Haran, the father of Micah, and the father of Ishka.
Okay. So Milcah would have been Nahor's niece.
Yeah, so I just figured that out.
Yeah, so the family marrying thing is still going pretty strong here. You still didn't have too many options yet, and you had to pick somebody who spoke your language for the most part. So, in general, they're marrying close within families. Verse 30 is really interesting. So it says, "But Sarai was barren, and she had no child." This is the first time in the Bible barrenness is mentioned as a concept. So you've never had anyone else be listed as being barren. So that may be really why Abram had a hard time thinking they would have a child. Like you said, it's because of Sarai. There's not been women like this who've been barren all this time. And that probably made her feel very odd because everybody else around her's having children. And so we deal with a lot more barrenness now than they did then. But that was actually, in different times, a sign of cursing from God. As a matter of fact, in Deuteronomy, which if you're in my class and haven't gone to class yet, you'll find this out later. He talks about how if they will follow him, there will be no barrenness in the land for the animals or the people. And so barrenness in some senses is a symbol, or can be a symbol, not always, but can be a symbol of people not being right with the Lord. And so she probably was looked upon with contempt by some because she had no children.
That passage in Leviticus where it talks about the test for unfaithfulness.
The jealousy spirit,
The jealousy test.
Yeah.
One of the things it says is if the woman has committed adultery, then she'll be barren.
Right.
So it's very, very much associated, even as early as Moses' day.
Yeah.
Very much associated with punishment from God.
Right. And so they would have still been a very uncommon thing. Maybe she wasn't the first one who was barren, but she's the first one listed in the Bible who was. And so I doubt she knew many people that were like her in that regard.
You can't go forth and multiply and replenish the ark if you're barren.
Right. That's true. Yeah. And so in their view, that may have made them seem cursed from God in different ways. And like I said, that would have definitely brought some contempt upon her. Yes. I looked like you started talking.
I'm good.
Okay.
Look at some of the other women though that are listed as being barren. Some of the famous people in the Bible.
Yeah.
What was it? Samson's mom.
Okay.
Samuel's mother.
Yep. Elizabeth. Yeah.
That's John the Baptist's mom.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's a lot of famous folks that come from women who were considered cursed by God.
Right.
When in fact God was preparing a special blessing.
Right. And that's why I wanted to specify that the way I did, is because just because it can be associated with cursing doesn't always mean it is. Just like the Jews in the New Testament, basically they saw a man born blind, they said, who sinned, this man or his parents?
Yeah.
And Jesus said, well, nobody, this was done to glorify God. And so sometimes that is the scenario, but at other times it is certainly something that God will curse upon people. Also in, who was it? I think it was when Rebekah was taken by Abimelech.
Yeah.
God had already cursed the people with barrenness
Right.
before he had
His whole
done
household.
anything.
His
Oh yeah.
whole household.
Yeah. And so again, that's another picture of barrenness being tied in with judgment in different cases. Now it's not always, but it is sometimes. All right. Verse 31. We got
Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarah his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go to the land of Canaan. And they came unto Haran and dwelt there.
All right, so the question, was Haran named after Haran? I don't know. But Haran would have died early. He didn't live very long. He lived enough to have a son, namely Lot. But because of that, it seems like Abram had kind of become a father figure for Lot. Lot goes everywhere Abram goes. They kind of go together in all sorts of situations. But it's interesting, Terah had already felt the need to move out of Ur and start heading towards the land of Canaan. God, again, is preparing the people that he's planning to use. Lot is Abraham's nephew. If you kind of look at the family line, you can see it there. I think it says it more explicitly elsewhere, like Abram's nephew Lot. But, I mean, you can get a picture of it here. And they didn't make it exactly where they wanted to go, but they seem to have stopped in Haran. In verse 32.
And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran.
Yeah, so Terah actually lived to 205, which is a decent age for the people he's around. So the secret is you wait till you're 70 to have babies, and then you live 200 years. So,
You're having yours too young.
I know. I told my mom I wasn't going to live very long. That's why. I didn't know it at the time, but that's why. It's the stress they put you under. Anyhow, Terah lived 205 years. Shem would have outlived Abraham by 35 years. And Noah would have lived until Abraham was about 85. So, if you don't believe that Melchizedek is a theophany or something like that, Noah would have been the only person around who had no parents and would have been alive about the time that Abraham would have seen Melchizedek. So, fun thoughts there. Some people think it could have been Shem. Some people think it was just a theophany and we're looking too much into it. Anyway, if anyone doesn't know what a theophany is, it is a physical manifestation of God during a limited portion of time.
Pre-incarnate.
Pre-incarnate, yeah. So well, even incarnate, that's a theophany of God. It's a physical representation. So, but like the burning bush was a theophany. The pillar and the cloud were theophanies. There are different ways God presents himself in in Genesis 19. God comes down, or I think it's 18, when he's prepping for 19, he comes down and he talks with Abraham as a man. So those are all different theophanies of God. So the problem with Melchizedek being a theophany, and we'll get to this as we get to that chapter, is he seemed to be a king of a specific area. So people would have known him.
But he did represent Christ because Jesus, no priest could be a king or vice versa.
Right.
But Jesus is priest and king.
Right, and he
So
was.
was Melchizedek.
Yeah. And obviously you get the picture from Psalm 110 that Jesus had to be from the order of Melchizedek, this prophet king of an eternal order, because the Aaronic priesthood was not able to continue by reason of death. And we've talked about that lots and lots in the book of Hebrews. So Melchizedek's a big picture there, even though there's really not that much Old Testament given to the study of Melchizedek. You get, a few verses in chapter 14, I think, and then you get a couple verses about him in the Psalms, and you don't have much else.
One of the most disturbing things I heard was a client of mine that was struggling. She was Catholic, and she was really struggling with leaving the Catholic because of the sexual abuse. And some woman, a Catholic woman, had written a book on Melchizedek, and using that priestly figure convinced my client and several other people that this was, because they were questioning the authenticity of their priests, so they were pointing everybody beyond their priest to Melchizedek, who was their priest. It was very disturbing.
Yeah.
It's also very contrived.
Oh, definitely.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but Catholics, they just don't know.
Well, that's it.
Yeah.
People don't know the history of where the concepts that they're taught, where those conceptually come about, and when.
Yeah.
Because all of what we see as modern Catholicism is based on Augustine. Augustine didn't come along until 400 years after the time of, after the first century. He came along 300 years after the end of the first century.
Yeah.
And all of those concepts that we see as modern Catholicism, all of them post-date that period, and most of them come about after the Bishop of Rome declared himself to be the supreme ruler of the whole church, and the Orthodox Church said,
Nope.
No, we don't think so, and
Yeah.
we had the great split.
Yeah. Yeah, the Great Schism is very interesting. But even then, that would have been hundreds of years after the time of Augustine. And some of the things may have started, I've heard Catholic apologists say this, Catholic doctrine is like an acorn. It's planted, and they have seeds of things, and they grow up into fuller doctrines later, which is why they don't apologize for having doctrines that don't pop up until the 1800s or the 1600s, because God was just opening it up and growing it until it finally reached its fruition. So, I mean, even, I don't understand how you can go from Augustine to the Council of Trent. Like that, I mean, ridiculous. Complete opposition to one another.
It's still changing now.
Oh,
Sure.
It's still changing.
but that's because it's based on church tradition, and it's not based on something that's eternal.
Yeah, the interpretation of church.
Right. Oh.
Interpretations.
When you have two living popes that say, one says homosexuality is wrong, and the other one says, it's fine. Yeah. So, yeah, lots going on there. Anyway, guys, that is all for class today. I'm actually got you out at a decent time. Pastor will be happy with me.
Did